countries mainly from the eastern flank were in favor of Ukraine joining. So where was the resistance coming from?
Well, it's a paradox that the country which expressed lackluster enthusiasm when it comes to NATO membership was the United States. The United States is of the opinion that if we extended and if we let Ukraine access NATO quickly, this would result in a potential war between NATO and Russia, and that's what the United States is opposed to for obvious reasons. What's more, the United States is saying that Ukraine is not yet ready to become a NATO member, that Ukraine has made a substantial progress on its reform path, but it's still not enough.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'll be talking to Jakub Graca, an expert from OSW's Security and Defence Department. We'll be discussing the recent NATO summit in Vilnius. Okay, so today we want to discuss the recent NATO summit in Vilnius. But right ahead of the summit we had a small surprise because Turkey finally gave Sweden the green light to join the alliance.
Well, to a certain degree, we can say that it was a surprise, but on the other hand, the negotiations between Turkey and Sweden, with the presence of the NATO Secretary General, were constantly ongoing. There was a stated objective of the NATO Secretary General, as well as of the key NATO allies, most importantly the United States, to speed up negotiations and to bring this to an end, to a successful end. So to a certain degree, it was a surprise, but not necessarily in full. The agreement that was struck between Turkey and Sweden and the NATO Secretary General is stating that Turkey will, so the executive power in Turkey, the president of Turkey will forward the accession protocol of Sweden to the assembly, to the legislative chamber of Turkey, and will work closely with the legislative branch to ratify this protocol as quickly as it is possible. So it looks like, on the face of it, Turkey has agreed to the ratification of the accession protocol for Sweden, but we cannot be 100% sure until it finally happens. The question is when it will happen. By all probability, it will happen in the fall of 2023. It is unlikely it will happen beforehand. Let's also remember there is Hungary that has not ratified the accession protocol for Sweden yet. So it takes both Hungary and Turkey for Sweden to become a NATO member.
So we will. Yeah. We will still be waiting to see.
Yeah, we'll still be waiting.
So
So the prospects seem to be positive, but we cannot be 100% certain until it finally happens.
Okay, so onto the summit itself. What did we learn from the summit? What were the main points of the summit?
I would say we can pinpoint three main takeaways from the summit. The first and foremost is deterrence and defense of NATO. Secondly, it's Ukraine, the Ukraine question, and thirdly, it's Indo-Pacific. Let's maybe start from the first one because deterrence and defense is by far and away the most important and the most consequential thing that has happened and that was discussed during the summit. So NATO decided to strengthen its deterrence and defense strategy, partly going back to what was in place during the Cold War, and what NATO walked away from in the aftermath of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. What the strengthening of the deterrence and defense strategy consists in is the adoption of three, the so-called regional defense plans. One for the north of Europe, the second one for the Central Europe from the Baltic Sea region to the Alps, and the third one encompasses the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Black Sea region. These three regional defense plans make an epochal change for NATO, the biggest and more consequential change since the Cold War ended. In terms of the defense planning process and the structure thereof, NATO is partly coming back to what was during the Cold War. And what's more, these plans are the first step. What will follow will be the assignment of specific forces as well as specific command units to those plans. Will be the prepositioning of equipment in the specific countries. Will be the financing. It is a very important topic because NATO, as we well remember, NATO back in 2014, there was a NATO summit in Wales, Newport, Wales, when NATO agreed to 2% of GDP as a target for defense spending, and NATO agreed at the time. NATO agreed to reach that.
And it's a 2% minimum for every NATO member.
At the time, it wasn't stated as minimum. It was stated as minimum. It wasn't until 2023 that it was stated very directly as a minimum. So at the time, it was stated rather as a goal, as a target, as something that we should strive for. And NATO was about to achieve it until 2024. But it was apparent back a few years ago that it wouldn't happen. So NATO this year, it wasn't until 2023 that NATO agreed to stay.
You say it wasn't going to happen, but many NATO members are spending above 2% already. But
it depends what you mean by many. 11 countries. Estimations have it that by the end of this year, in 2023, 11 allies will have expended the required 2% of the GDP on defense. So, given that NATO comprises 31 and soon to be 32, hopefully, member states, it's not that many, I would say. So this makes some progress, but we'll see, of course, jury's out what will happen and if it will happen within the required time frame. So back to deterrence and defense. This is the epochal change in the NATO strategy, and this is the first step. Prepositioning of equipment, NATO force structure reform, NATO command structure, the so-called new force model adopted in 2022 at the Madrid summit. This will follow as well. So what it consists in is that now we have up to 40,000 high readiness NATO troops, and the reform has it that the number of troops, most importantly high readiness troops, will be increased from 40,000 to 300,000. And this is a huge change. So if NATO is able, provided NATO is able to implement this change, so implement and fund this change, it will be something great. And
so these numbers are very significant. The increase in numbers. You mentioned about the prepositioning of weapons and troops. Are there any particular directions that they are being moved to?
Most importantly, it's the eastern flank, because the eastern flank is that part of the alliance that is most prone to the Russian threat, and based on the NATO strategy, which was reaffirmed in the declaration of the Vilnius summit. Russia is the most imminent and substantial or significant threat to NATO. So, given that that NATO borders Russia from the west, the eastern flank is most vulnerable to Russian attack. We are speaking most importantly about the eastern flank. And when it comes to the eastern flank, there's one more thing that needs to be brought up, namely the presence of NATO troops on the eastern flank. Because the NATO force model that I brought up consists of forces that are to be deployed on a rapid basis, high readiness forces. But when it comes to the permanent presence on the NATO eastern flank, NATO didn't agree to enhance the presence from the battalion-sized battle groups to the brigade-sized battle groups, and that is something that is potentially, mainly from the point of view of the eastern flank, that is something that is potentially missing. But NATO will so to say replace it or compensate the lack of permanent brigade-sized units on the eastern flank. Will compensate it with rapidly deployable forces, as well as with the NATO force model, which consists of high readiness forces of up to 300,000.
And these will also be located on the eastern flank, or they're ready
they
to
will
deploy?
They will be located in all the countries of NATO, depending on which country of NATO decides to commit on how big forces every country of NATO will decide to commit. They will be stationed all around NATO and ready to deploy when and where necessary.
Talking of the eastern flank, and that this is the area that NATO shares a border with Russia, it also shares a border with Belarus, and there has been talk about the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Was this discussed during the summit?
This was discussed during the summit, and NATO employed some new wording in the declaration of the Vilnius summit. The wording has it that NATO will strengthen and enhance or develop its nuclear strategy. Will modernize its nuclear capabilities, as well as NATO will be ready to broaden the possibility or the scope of the nuclear sharing program over as many members as possible. So this potentially includes some willing states, such as Poland, for example. This potentially gives a chance for such countries as Poland to be a party to the nuclear sharing program in the future, not necessarily by having the nuclear warheads stationed in Poland, but rather having F-35 jets certified for the objective, for the purpose of deploying nuclear warheads. So this is a slight change, and time will tell how consequential this change will be.
Okay, thank you. So the second aspect that you said was the main takeaway was Ukraine, and we were expecting to hear something about the prospects for Ukraine joining NATO. What did we hear?
First and foremost, the NATO Ukraine Commission, which has been in place since 1997, was finally transformed into the NATO Ukraine Council. The NATO Ukraine Council means that both parties, NATO and Ukraine, will sit as equals and will not only be able to consult with each other, but they will also be able to make decisions. And a session of the NATO Ukraine Council can be summoned either by Ukraine or by NATO, and even if a certain member state of NATO, such as Hungary, is opposed to a session, it will not be able to block it, unlike what we have now. And now it will be possible for one country, for one member state of the alliance to block. So beforehand, before NATO-Ukraine Commission was transformed into NATO-Ukraine Council, it was possible for one country to block a session of the NATO-Ukraine Commission. Now it won't be possible anymore. So that's one change. The other change is that NATO agreed to reaffirmed the declaration of the Bucharest summit of 2008, when NATO agreed that someday Ukraine will become a member of NATO. So NATO reaffirmed that position. What's more, NATO agreed that that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. So an invitation will be extended to Ukraine by NATO when conditions are met and allies agree. So it is implied.
Okay, and these conditions, do we know these conditions?
Officially, we don't, but we can guess that the main condition is the end of the war. NATO also decided to release Ukraine of a bureaucratic hurdle, which is the so-called membership action plan. Back in 2008, NATO didn't agree to give Ukraine the membership action plan, and now NATO decided to abolish that step, to bypass that step. So there's a slight change, but for the time being, nothing more was in fact possible. So there were countries, mainly from the eastern flank, that were hoping for even an invitation, for a direct invitation for Ukraine to become a NATO member, but it wasn't likely to happen. That's all Ukraine can have now.
Countries mainly from the eastern flank were in favor of Ukraine joining. So where was the resistance coming from?
Well, it's a paradox that the country which expressed lackluster enthusiasm when it comes to NATO membership was the United States. Back to 2008 and the Bucharest summit, the administration of George W. Bush was trying to, personally was trying to convince allies to grant Ukraine the membership action plan as quickly as it was possible, but it didn't happen. Now the United States is rather cautious. The United States is of the opinion that if we extended and if we let Ukraine access NATO quickly, this would result in a potential war between NATO and Russia, and that's what the United States is opposed to for obvious reasons. What's more, the United States is saying that Ukraine is not yet ready to become a NATO member, that Ukraine has made a substantial progress on its reform path, but it's still not enough. So there are a couple of factors and conditions that are to be met according to the United States. And the second country is Germany. On the other hand, you have the UK, which is in theory in favor of Ukraine joining NATO as quickly as it is possible, but not until the war ends. And you have also France, which is trying to take advantage of, and personally President Macron is trying to take advantage of the situation that the United States and Germany are not in favor of a quick accession path for Ukraine to NATO. And President Macron is expressing his readiness to talk about a swift membership option and to position himself in a role of a mediator. Time will tell if there's a...
We say mediator, not between Ukraine and NATO, but between Ukraine and Russia.
This will depend on the situation. So time will tell to what degree this stance of President Macron and France is a strategic objective, and to what extent it is a tactical position. But most importantly is the United States and Germany who are opposed to the quick accession path for Ukraine.
I heard that on the sidelines of the conference, the G7 met and made a declaration on Ukraine. Could you tell us some more about this?
So the declaration of the G7 group concentrates on the long-term security commitments and arrangements for Ukraine, not guarantees, because there was a lot of talk about security guarantees for Ukraine in the short and medium term, in the long run as well. But these are not security guarantees, these are security commitments. The declaration is a tool, is an umbrella under which these countries, the G7 countries, committed to work out and formalize their long-term security commitments and arrangements for Ukraine. The goal, the stated objective of the commitments is to furnish Ukraine with force which would be capable of defending against Russia now and deterring the potential Russian threat and aggression in the future. So this encompasses various factors, manifold ways to enhance Ukraine's capabilities. These countries will want to equip Ukraine with necessary equipment, with financial aid, reconstitute its defense sector so that its defense sector would be capable of producing necessary weaponry and capabilities on its own, to the degree it is possible. So there are manifold ways listed out in the declaration how the G7 countries will try to help Ukraine defend itself in the future and deter the Russian aggression. It remains to be seen how this will be implemented, because it will depend to a large degree on the political will in the G7 countries, depending on the changes of governments, because these are all democratic countries, so they are vulnerable to the changes of opinions and governments. Time will tell, but in the optimistic scenario, this may help Ukraine in the long run defend itself against Russia and maintain its sovereignty and independence in the long run. It is a very important declaration, and that's something that Ukraine was waiting for, that Ukraine was hoping for, and that happened. But remains to be seen how this will be implemented.
Okay. And so it brings us to the final point, and I would like to say that this discussion is accompanying a text which OSW has on its website. You are one of the authors of it. And I read in that text that the discussions on the Indo-Pacific region were somehow marginalized because of the importance of deterrence and defense and Ukraine. But could you tell us a little about what we learned about NATO and the Indo-Pacific?
I wouldn't say it was marginalized during the summit. It was partly marginalized in the media, because the NATO is a Euro-Atlantic alliance. So NATO is not going to be embroiled in any military activities in the Indo-Pacific theater, but there is a growing awareness within NATO, among NATO allies, that there is an interconnection between the Euro-Atlantic theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. So NATO is strengthening and deepening its partnership with 4 Indo-Pacific partners, which are Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. It wasn't the first time that the leaders of those 4 countries were invited to a NATO summit. The first one was a year ago, but the awareness of a growing challenge from China is on the rise in NATO. When we look at the documents of NATO over the past 4 years, China was first mentioned after summit declaration in 2019, and year after year, the rhetoric of NATO when it comes to China was stronger, and now it is really, really strong. And NATO does not call China its adversary, but partly under the pressure from the United States, partly under its own observations, NATO is becoming much more aware that China poses a long-term systemic challenge to NATO, and China's stated ambitions and coercive policies, that's the exact wording from the declaration, pose a direct threat, run counter to and pose a direct threat to the values and interests of NATO and its allies. So this is something that we can expect to be developing, to be on the rise as time passes by. So NATO is deepening partnership with these countries. Nothing spectacular has happened by now, but there's a constant progress with regards to the relation between NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you too.
Thanks for watching this interview. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all future content.